right, welcome. Thank you everybody for coming out this evening to the Coastal Studies Institute and ECU's Outer Banks Campus. Enjoy your one day of fall because I think winter hits tomorrow. So it was a nice one day that we had. Anyway, thank you for coming for the Science on the Sound this evening. I wanted to give a few some information on upcoming programs before I introduce our guest speaker. And so I think I always sort of mention what our next Science on the Sound will be. So December 12th, actually at 4 p.m., not 6 p.m., December 12th at 4 p.m. will be the UNC Chapel Hill capstone presentation. And so every year in the fall, we have a cohort of UNC Chapel Hill students that work on a project collectively across the Outer Banks. This project is focused in Currituck Sound, focused on some of the marsh islands with the Audubon that are sort of disappearing through erosion and other things. And so it'll be a summary of their research project during this past semester. And so that's on December 12th at 4 p.m. We are still running some family programs. The next one's November 25th. It is Exploring Oyster Ecology. And so this is, it is families, although, you know, it's for kids of all ages as well. We do get kids of all ages that come with or without other family members, and so it's always fun to see who might show up for these. And so November 25th is the next event that we have. And as always, we do 2 guided tours a month. The next ones will be November 27th and December 11th. To get a tour of the facility, learn a little bit more about all the ongoings for the Coastal Studies Institute, some of the research, some of the academic programs, and opportunities that you might find across many of our different programs. All right, I don't think I introduced myself. I always sort of forget to do that. I know many of you in the audience. So my name's Reed Corbett. I'm the executive director here at the Coastal Studies Institute. So again, welcome. We're very excited to have one of our community partners from the Park Service here with us today, George Jaramillo.
Jaramillo.
Anyway, I told him I can't roll my R's.
It's fine.
So George,
thank
you for being here today. George has been on the Outer Banks for about 2 years. Is that right, George?
A little over 2 years.
A little over 2 years.
Yeah.
George is, again, with the National Park Service as a historic architect for the Outer Banks group. I looked up a little bit about George. He actually has this really interesting educational background. A degree in architecture from Cornell, a master's in historic preservation from Columbia, and a PhD in cultural geography from the University of Edinburgh. And so, I mean, a really interesting way of putting together these different opportunities to end up where he is today as the Park Service historic architect. As part of this, and I hope I'm not giving away too much of what you're going to talk about, George, but he manages historic structures across 3 park units of the Outer Banks, exploring the history, architectural significance, and key adaptation strategies to preserve them for the future. With over 20 years of architecture, heritage, and design experience within the private and public sectors, George collaborates across a variety of disciplines to rethink our relationships with the built environment. And I think this is a great example. We look forward to hearing it. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for having me here and for the Coastal Studies Institute as well. I start out with a kind of common picture that we all know and probably maybe have some memories of in the past. This is actually Hurricane Dorian in 2019. And this year marks that 5th anniversary of the path of what was a Category 5 hurricane that had landed in the Bahamas, but by the 6th of September of that same year of 2019, quite a different hurricane, slightly less powerful, but just as destructive, would hit the island of Ocracoke. And it had brought about an over 7-foot storm surge that morning, and really brought about kind of an impact to that island and to the region as well that is still being felt today, to a point that we're still probably maybe rethinking that relationship to our space. As someone who comes from a similar type of landscape, I'm born and bred in Miami, Florida, and experienced many a hurricane, particularly Hurricane Andrew. Quite kind of, I guess, the psyche towards those types environmental spaces. This talk is about the way that we adapt, the way that we've historically adapted as a way to think through our historic adaptation processes. So we were constantly adapting. So you'll probably hear the word adaptation a lot in this talk. We'll see how those adaptations over time have particularly been practiced at the Ocracoke Light Station. And finally, we'll look at how today we are attempting to do further adaptations, perhaps maybe quite a dramatic adaptation to preserve the light station for the future. I'd like to first start out with kind of just defining what adaptation is, or how I'm kind of approaching it. We tend to sometimes use resilience and adaptation almost interchangeably, but in this instance, resilience can be thought through as a kind of a general ability to master challenges, whereas adaptation is more of a state reflecting how individuals deal with specific stressors. So sometimes people say, oh no, well, buildings can't be adaptable, but I like to think of myself as kind of thinking through the ability for structures to adapt, just as people do, to their environment, and can be reflective of that, of those changes. For many of us probably here know, but for those playing at home, we're out here on the Outer Banks. I sometimes like to say it's the edge, but in many cases, it could be the center of a much vast system. Its early history is filled with kind of Algonquin-speaking folks who had inhabited this region for many centuries prior to the arrival of European folk. On Ocracoke itself, it was quite an important site in the kind of pre-colonial and colonial history of the region, particularly for portage, because of the kind of limited areas of travel across the waters of the east coast of North Carolina. This area between Portsmouth Village and Ocracoke allowed for people to enter into Pamlico Sound and then into the rest of the interior of North Carolina. It's also been known as a space where a pirate of Blackbeard was known to inhabit and explore in that region as well through that early kind of proto-colonial period. Come on, there we go. But in that early kind of 19th century period, as the establishment of the country had just been dedicated and formed, a need to light the harbors of that coastal region was created. And interestingly, this is a great quote that tells us what the purpose of the light station was. And to most folk, probably a lighthouse is to guide, but in this instance, it's to warn, of the fact that the vessels who are inbound from passing the bar at night. So they're trying to warn folk to kind of keep aware of what's out there on the sound and in the inlet. So it's quite an interesting space that the harbor light is used as a way to give that kind of warning. The original light station was designed with very kind of a particular set of specifications, quite a stout tower. There's a whole other talk about the lighthouse that I also have, that I'm also working on. But this right now is about the actual double keeper's quarters, and so we're going to focus on that particular thing. And if you keep up on the upper right-hand corner, you'll see this little diagram. It will change over time as the building develops over the last 2 centuries. The light station itself began as quite just a little 2-room structure, but like all good specifications, what goes on paper is never what actually gets built in real life. And so it had a little bit of an attic space and actually a small kitchen in the back. 2-foot thick brick, solid masonry brick walls that went down about 20 or so inches. And your kind of typical brick masonry building. It was solid. It was not going to go anywhere. That decision to create that lighthouse there may have been maybe a little bit thinking through perhaps of that changing space, because a few years later, or about maybe 20 or 30 or so years later, the inlet around Ocracoke Island began to change, as many of our inlets here alter and change. And its passability became limited with the eventual almost downfall of Portsmouth Village across the way now in Cape Lookout, but the same for the pilot kind of industry that had been developed over on this side of the island, of the inlet itself. Interestingly, there is another great exploration of the coastal survey. There's a series of markers here on the coast that kind of predate most of our GIS systems, and it marks the geodetic. The whole reason why we have amazing maps is a set of markers that are placed all along the coastline, and we have a full set of 8 along a mile stretch just off of the NC-12 in Body Island. Can't really see them. They're in the water, they're in the marsh, but they're quite exciting, and we're working on trying to interpret that aspect of our history as well, for those GIS nerds in the crowd. So one of the first editions of the Ocracoke Light Station was just your little kind of a little salt box addition to the back of the house. They added I guess you could say like a dining room of sorts, and just extended it to the back. And here you can actually see the way that the little upper attic room itself was built as well. This is one of the first images that we have of the light station and of the lighthouse. It's the keeper's quarters. At this point, it was just one keeper and his family living out there in the kind of between the 1870s and the 1890s. So granted, at this time, they were just finishing the construction of Hatteras Light as well as Body Light. So the light station here predates most of that by a good 50 years' time. Here's another great view from the other side. You can see there really well the little wooden addition of the dining room in the back. Here kind of gives us a basic overlay of what it used to look like. So this is the house itself. There's the little dining room in the back. There's a little storehouse, a privy, and the lighthouse itself. Set of marshes. I love the way that they use just kind of squiggly lines for trees. I'm a big map nerd, so I find this as a really great exploration in how we represent the environment around us. And then a really significant transformation occurred in the late 1890s. The whole house got upgraded. A desire to really improve the life of the keeper and his family, and improvement of the lighthouse service itself was evident. And in this instance, the whole house got elevated or brought up to 2 levels completely. A porch was added to the front, and the back dining room that was enclosed was then turned back into an open porch. So it went from being to being closed to being open, and then the space in the front also added with a porch. This is one of the only views that we have of the building. Unfortunately, it's only kind of the far left edge of it. So this here is this little edge right over here. So you can see the a little bit of it raised, again, with the trees in the front. We'll talk about those trees as well later on. And through the early 20th century, we had a bit of a, I call it the changing tides, this kind of introduction of kind of the codification of tourism, a new use for kind of naval facilities, the construction of naval facilities in Ocracoke itself. Here's the establishment of the CCC camp in Buxton, as well as the planting of vegetation along the coastline just around Hatteras Tower. That also, transformation was felt in Ocracoke itself. And again, we now see this is the old house there. And now we have a whole new, almost doubling the size of the structure. So we go from a tiny little rectangle to kind of a bigger rectangle, 2 stories, to now a full kind of almost L shape or U shape, depending on how you see it, structure. So if you notice here, this is the old house there. Well, the old house is really this part. There's the 1890s house, again, adapting. And then finally, this whole new house in the late 1920s. So a full 105 years later, we have a completely different house, different construction of a wholly different format, slightly designed in a different way, stylized in a different way, a much more simpler way, and with different building technology. Again, something important to note because of how we're going to work on it in the future. Even more, so like again, we are in a constant state of changing and adapting and reworking. And you could say, George, as someone who works in the preservation, how do you deal with all of these changes? Very carefully, but also appreciating those changes and acknowledging those adaptations and actually making the leap of that adaptation is part of our heritage. It is part of our historic practice, particularly out here in the Outer Banks. In the 1950s, when by this time the light station had been owned by the Coast Guard, the Coast Guard decided to go through another set of alterations and adaptations, making it a bit more modern. The introduction of a screen porch, because everyone loves a screen porch. But also, very interestingly, the tower received a very thick, I like to call it like a raincoat, very thick raincoat of shotcrete, or just also termed gunite, is an old term that used to be used. So it's about 2-3 inches of gunite all the way around the masonry of the tower, all up and down, to preserve it. Also to make it much easier to maintain, because it is a lot of work to maintain a lighthouse, even a short one like this one. And the tower, and then eventually the tower also became automated. And so all of these changes occurred in the mid-50s to improve the light station's house, the lightkeeper's house, and then they automated the light. And so there was no more need for a keeper to live there anymore. And so it became transferred, the house and the whole station became transferred over to the Park Service for its use. At that time, with the establishment of the National Seashore. The seashore has a unique history of its own, being kind of designated by Congress in the late 30s, but not really kind of established until the early 50s, and really kind of inaugurated until the late 50s. So this period of time of, like just before the war, then after the war, and then the kind of early Cold War period really brought about this transformation of what a national seashore would be. And in the end, the Park Service itself would also adapt and try to rethink what the light station could be used for. It's still used as a lighthouse, but the station itself, the building itself, would be probably at first be empty for a while, but then turned into housing. Housing has always been kind of the need here, not only on Ocracoke, but across the Outer Banks. And across many of the places that I lived in has pretty much been the thing. Everyone is like, housing, where will I live? How will I live? And so in this instance, this is a great plot plan of the, from the Coast Guard itself that shows at this point the main dwelling unit, the cistern, the storehouse, a little privy in the back, a carpenter shop. There was a line here of fencing, then the oil house, the lighthouse itself, and then a garage that sat right on the marsh, which is like, okay, well, I guess you like having your car wet, but you know, that's all cool. And by the 60s, there are these great, it's probably my little ad for the Outer Banks History Center. They're a great resource as well, and a great group space just here on Roanoke Island with excellent digital collection, but also a physical collection just down the road here in Manio on Festival Park. Again, one more time, our team, illustrious team, this time from the NPS, in the 80s, began a huge restoration. Big. It tried to really redefine what the light station was about, how it would try to reconnect with the community. There was a lot of repairs that it needed to be done. They tried to upgrade the structural framing underneath. They tried to reconnect, because basically, as you can see, it's two buildings, right, that happen to be married together on the roof. And really trying to address the NPS mission, I like to think of it as a little bit of a double-edged sword, to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values, but also for the enjoyment and education of the public. So that balance between preservation and use has always been kind of at the center of the Park Service. And great, some cool drone footage that we recently captured, actually about a year ago, of the light station itself. But we live in these dynamic environments. Don't know if anyone recalls these guys. These are the coquina sunshades built in the early establishment of the seashore. It was a fun day in the sun. That was its kind of quote. But we have here in 2011, after Hurricane Irene, a view of Pea Island National Wildlife Refuge. Again, these transformations, these almost dramatic changes that we are trying to work off, as well as the impact of thinking through futures and those uncertain futures of sea level rise as predicted from various circumstances, from the lowest type of prediction to the highest prediction itself. But interestingly, we go back to Hurricane Dorian 5 years ago and the aftermath of what had happened, 18 inches of water inside the house itself. The storehouse moved off of its footings, totally just kind of shifted off. The privy, which is kind of expected, is a tiny little house, so it was moved, but also damage to the lighthouse itself, to the exterior coating, and then just flooding. That is the front of the station, that with waters not yet receding at that time. And so within those dynamic environments, living within those barrier islands, and trying to work through the several decades of how do we work again? How do we try to rethink our relationship? What to do? Like all good government agencies, lots of meetings were held, and consultations, and environmental assessment was developed to work out what we could do here on the coast. This is also, I love this image. This kind of gives you an idea of how not only the coast has moved, but also in a much more dramatized way, but also how many inlets have been created and have been lost over the last 5-6 centuries. Through those environmental assessments, the sea level rise had been described here. This is from earlier, maybe about 3 years ago. There are new newer prediction levels. But the green and the blue is basically the level of rise from about a foot to about 1.5 feet by 2050. The light station is right there. So this was 4 years ago, 6 years from now, and then 26 years from now. Again, using kind of the intermediate set of predictions. This can be accessed online through the NOAA Sea Level prediction website. It's a really great website, not when you're feeling very anxious about the future, but maybe a way to, again, maybe think through how we can adapt and work within that uncertainty. So we have this great station. We have our structures that have kind of been cattywampus, the storehouse, the privy is back here. This is the oil house. The carpenter shop is kind of hidden away under the oak trees. And the generator house there, and then the actual station itself. The station is quite small, sits on a very tiny trapezoidal site, and bound by houses just to the northeast, and then a series of small cemeteries, and then a marsh right next to it. It pretty much is turning into a marsh, as we have found out. Through that environmental assessment, we went through a series of kind of scenarios and came up with 3 potential adaptation ideals, which I like to call it the recreate, elevate, and commemorate. So recreate meant that we would rebuild the light station and the keeper's quarters to its original 1823 format. Elevate, meaning we raise the entire station up to a certain predetermined, approved level. And finally, commemorate. The whole thing goes away. No light station, just the tower. And you end up with, say, a ghost structure. Maybe you've seen, there's a good example, if you've ever been to Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin's house is one where it's just a kind of a frame building out of metal, white metal. It's quite striking. Through some review and use of money that came also from a special pot to support hurricane recovery, we were able to think through the idea of actually elevating the structure. The DKQ, you'll probably see DKQ is short for double keeper's quarters, as well as the rehabilitation of the structure and create more resilient materials for the structure, as well as elevate a few of the outbuildings. Not as high as the DKQ, but higher than what they are right now. At the moment, the height of the DKQ is just under 5 feet at about 4'11". It's finished floor elevation, so that's the interior floor height of the kind of the main floor of the house. This is just under 5 feet. So it would be determined that the DKQ would be elevated between 4, maybe an extra 6. There were many rules as to what determines that, particularly the kind of highest storm surge, to maximize kind of the time that this building can withstand those storm surges. A storm surge of about 8 feet was determined to be kind of the highest storm surge that we would go with, and then go up an extra foot. And for good measure, we go up an extra foot because the house is actually at 2 different heights. The lower floor finish elevation is about 10 inches lower. So the finished floor elevation would be raised an extra 5 feet, so about 10 feet or so. Quite about maybe just about maybe about 2 feet below the top of these ceilings. So the height, quite a big difference, a big change. Granted, we did move the lighthouse a couple of thousand feet, so changing it maybe 5 feet higher is still a dramatic change from what it is today. The layout of the structure is very simple. We always have to have a floor plan. in an architectural presentation. This just gives you a very clear idea of the basically two buildings smushed together. So the question is, how do you move two structures, elevate them up in a tiny confined space with 100-year-old oak trees around it that happen to be built of two totally different materials, two totally different building technologies, a century apart, right? One building is 200 years old, another one is about just 100 years old, and not have them move. So through the last couple of almost 2 years, we have been working at figuring that out. Hopefully, in the next month or so, we'll be able to now begin the process of elevating the structure. A series of investigations have been done by contractors, our architectural engineering firms, the actual lifting companies, to begin the process of answering that very, very good question. So in this very kind of simplified diagram, the building gets excavated around, about 2 feet below, around the whole structure, till you more or less hit just below the kind of the lowest part of the building framing, the structure. You will, I know the term will feel a little bit harsh, you sever the building, you basically cut the building from whatever its foundation is, still retaining those walls, right? Remember, it's a full masonry building. So there's going to be some foundation remaining that will have to be removed. That building is actually elevated on temporary structure called cribbing and a series of a lattice of steel beams. A set of main beams that run the length of the house and a set of support beams that support it in the opposite direction. The actual cribs themselves are built out of wood, and they are laid out in kind of an array that will temporarily hold and jack up the structure. So it's kind of set onto this lattice that then is put through this cribbing, and then the cribbing is slowly jacked up in a very, very careful manner to elevate it up to more or less its final height. Interestingly, the building isn't brought up and then brought down. The building is brought up to its finished height, and then you build a new set of structures underneath it to meet that structure. Quite ingenious. The final, and that's just to kind of see how this mass lives above it. And what gets built, and again, some people may say it may be over-engineered, is an array, I like to call it an array, a field of columns, of concrete piers that will be sunk into the ground. They're actually going to be cast with a set of footings, and then a concrete beam that will kind of marry the whole structure together. Again, remember, two buildings, two structures with two very different building technologies that all have to be worked together. You know, there was one idea at one point, what if we severed the building in half and lifted them separately? That was very quickly thrown out. But in the end, this approach will hopefully provide the necessary approach to get that structure up and out of at least what we hope to be the future storm surges of the next at least 50 years of time. Further adaptations that will be taken onto the building will include a series of brick lattice that will allow for the water to flow through. So the reason for the piers is that this way the whole structure is out of harm's way, out of storm surge way. There are no kind of solid walls, so even the brick lattice that goes in front to kind of hide some of these piers will be able to break away. They're very common in Charleston. If you've ever been down to Charleston, you've seen a lot of these kind of lattice brick walls. They're really beautiful, and I think will work really well here. At the moment, we've been prepping the building. This is the interior, this is the actual kitchen. It's quite exciting because you've torn away or removed a bit of the 1950s kitchen to expose in the 1890s kitchen, which half of it is actually underneath the floor joists. This is the chimney of that, and as you can see here, they filled in the opening for what would have been a cast iron stove, so the pipe for the stove itself. The kitchen used to sit right at grade, so that's why the difference in height between the main house and the kitchen in the back. Here's a rendering of what that house is scheduled to look like. I'm just checking to see time. We're all good. What the house is scheduled to look like. We have been working very well with our contractors, as well as the State Historic Preservation Office, to think through this adaptation. Questions include, how does it impact the integrity? Integrity is quite a big question of its historic integrity. You know, by changing the height, you now change the relationship and the massing of the buildings with everything else around it. You have altered the way you approach the structure, right? You have completely altered, you know, you're adding all of these extra staircases. At one point, there were many staircases, and if there are any architectural nerds in the room, it looked like a Palladian villa. And it's an inside joke, but Palladian villas are all full of stairs. So it definitely looked like a Palladian villa, and it was quite funny. I was like, we need to bring this back. So the outcome of these last couple of years to try to mitigate the impact of elevating the structure has been a collaboration, really, truly has been a collaboration. And also to think through the relationship of the landscape. So obviously we can adapt the building left and right, put it up, put it down, move it. But what about the landscape itself? The landscape keeps changing. You know, we've had these oak trees and also some cedars that have been there for at least a century. Those mix of oaks and cedars have been documented for at least 120 some odd years, and probably even older. And they are beautiful. They are just stunning. And again, the transformation of the ground from kind of this muddy, sandy soils to much more kind of brackish soils, marsh soils, as the marsh keeps encroaching into the landscape, has begun to impact as well what can actually grow on the site itself. There has been the removal of 4 trees, the oak trees that sit in the front of the house, and which they were all in very, very poor condition. And we're working with, actually not just one, but 2 arborists to work through what could be replaced, what could be planted in its place, and how we could perhaps, because again, if you go back, that's quite the change in height, right? The house that used to sit here now sits here to pretty much everybody. So that's a big difference and a big change to how the house feels, how it's approached, and again, its relationship to the landscape around it. And we need to think through again how we adapt, how we work with that very small landscape, as well as the transforming landscape that is happening around us. So in the end, I like to always say that we are always adapting. Adaptation is part of our heritage, particularly here in the Outer Banks. It's been something that in the last two years and change I've really come to admire as kind of an incomer, you could say. But we're hoping that we can see through our historic adaptation practices that we are just working off of those practices as one of those sets of practices for the future, and working through to mitigate, again, those adverse impacts that it means to elevate the structure up. And hopefully, we can begin to also provide some, say, new perspectives within the National Park Service. Lots of people are very interested in what's being done here. The State Historic Preservation Office is incredibly interested as one of these, as almost a case study for other types of not only light station structures, but other masonry buildings. It is rare to have a masonry building on the seashore, on any seashore, but on this seashore in particular, that isn't a lighthouse, right? That isn't a tower. So it is an incredibly special structure of which we need to take special care of, but also there's a lot of special attention being given to it, not only here domestically, but also internationally, as other coastal heritage sites across the world have very similar types of issues. And hopefully, this can become more collaborative to rethink those ideas of adaptation. And so hopefully in the end, by thinking through our historical adaptations, that historic provenance can guide how we think through our future adaptations. So thank you. I'm happy to take any questions. I think there's a microphone for people so that people on the live stream can listen. Go on ahead.
Are there any plans to raise the lighthouse itself?
That is a good question. There was at one point in the environmental assessment to elevate the lighthouse itself, but in the current plan, it is not. There is a plan to restore and rehabilitate the lighthouse. That is something I'm working on right now, which takes a long time to get through, many different hurdles, but at the moment, no, there isn't. The adaptations for the lighthouse would include to improve, say, its material resiliency. Many of these structures were not designed to have groundwater pretty much on it all the time in its footings and its foundations. So rising damp is quite a challenge to many of these masonry structures. So one of the adaptations would be to find solutions that would mitigate that groundwater infiltration. But it would be a very cool idea to elevate the lighthouse too.
George, I'm curious how Park has a lot of structures across, the 100 miles or so. How are you making decisions on which structures are a priority for thinking about adaptation?
That is a very good question. So we have been working over the last couple of years, actually 2 summers ago, we worked with a colleague of ours from Duke University. He was one of our interns, Everett. I'm just blanking on his last name. But he was one of our master's students who came out to do just that project, to develop basically an adaptation to vulnerability to significance kind of matrix through a series of factors and looking at sea level rise, storm surge impact, distance from the shore, as well as significance. So there are levels of significance. Structures can have national or state or regional or local significance. How resilient the structure is, resiliency determined by its construction technique, how much, for example, and this was a way for us to simplify things because it could get very crazy, very complicated very quickly. So we developed this approach that uses data that is easily accessible. So some of the data is from the National Register, some of it is from NOAA and those websites that show kind of sea level rise. And we tried to create this simple adaptation matrix to give us that kind of prioritization. And sometimes what has shown is it gives us this kind of great little diagram, like, oh, these buildings are really important. Basically, it creates this kind of quadrant diagram of very important and very vulnerable, and then not very important and not vulnerable at all, and then kind of in between. And sometimes that image has to then be mitigated with, say, budgets, use. Accessibility is another key point, because you could save something and it'd be great, but if it can't be reached, at least in current kind of infrastructure, then that's a whole other question. So to your point, I can send you Everett's master's thesis because he he has written about what he's done here. He's applied it in another park as well, another seashore as well. And my colleague, Michael Flynn, and I are actually working on the paper that talks about that adaptation matrix itself.
Of the three options, which was the most expensive to accomplish the
Of the
commemorate?
three
Yeah.
options, which one would be the most expensive? I don't have that information, but I think probably the reconstruction of it to its smaller form probably would be, because even though we're spending a little over $3 million to elevate the building and rehabilitate the building, to take it back to kind of its original form would require a lot of work, a lot of destruction, and also changing of the landscape and changing of things. And this project it's kind of a half and half. We're protecting and preserving the building as it is today, with some rehabilitative. So we're kind of restoring the interior to its 1890s appearance, part of the original building. But I feel that because destroying it completely probably be almost the cheapest, but also the most destructive to the psyche of Ocracoke Island. So I feel, depending on how you see the value of it, but for me, I think that had been the most expensive.
George, we do have a question from the online
Yeah.
audience. Has this project provided possible adaptations for the buildings in Portsmouth Village?
Oh, that is a good point. In Portsmouth Village, they are doing actually really cool stuff, and we're hoping that actually some of their adaptations influence our forms, because they're being very. They have a slightly different kind of things to work with. For those who may not know, Portsmouth Village is kind of a ghost town, an abandoned town at Cape Lookout, and they have been using different approaches to protect. Some have become just exterior rehabilitation, so the interiors haven't been restored, and it's just the outside, so they're almost become like little sculptures in the landscape. Some are used as interpretive spaces, so you can still go inside them, but not use them. And some are still actually being used, so the life-saving station there is still a proper space, and actually people, I think they have that volunteer program still established there to do that. To answer the question from our people on the live stream, I think what would probably be a way to apply some of these adaptations is maybe lessons learned on what is needed to really change or move, or what are the variables that you have to be really careful about. What are the, is it really necessary to, the values necessary to apply this process, right? Because it is expensive, it is hard, it is a big challenge. And so I think that is what will be useful in Portsmouth to help kind of inform those decision-making process in the future.
I have a second question here.
Oh, you still have the microphone.
So, as a 2-year resident, you obviously probably came in at the end of the decision-making process. Are you in agreement with the approach? You can cover up your yeah, and finally.
It is being live streamed.
Yeah. And finally, what's the purpose? What's the building going to be used for at the end of the day?
So to answer your second question, the building will be reopened as housing. So what we call the assistant keeper's quarters, the newer house, will be used as housing. The original keeper's quarters will be used as a visitor contact station. So this will be the first time, pretty much in its life, that it'll have been open to the public. And it will also house a small kind of apartment upstairs of that unit. We're hoping to use it as kind of a live-in lightkeeper type of program. but that's still something to work off of. But eventually it is to be a contact station so that people can come and visit the whole light station. Because right now, it has been pretty much fenced off. You know, you kind of just can walk on the boardwalk and go and look at the lighthouse, but that's it. To answer your first question, now that I've had time to think about it, I feel that it is the best solution to protect the building from at least its immediate effects of storm surge and hurricane issues. I think that there are, because I've been part of this program called Coastal Connections with the World Monuments Fund, and looking at other World Heritage sites around the world and how they've been working through other adaptation measures. There's a topic called adaptive release, which is a little bit kind of like allowing things to kind of return back to previous settings. That's not to say that that's what I want to happen here, but I feel that there could be, in the future, other forms of adaptations that we have yet to think of. But for now, I think this is a good approach, a solid approach that really will give new life, not only to the structure and future life to the structure, but also, I hope, will bring new life to the community as well. I think you had a question back there. Oh.
I'll ask a quick one as we're moving the mic. I'm curious about the community involvement and what the community thought with, obviously not the end result, we aren't there yet, but with the decision that the park has made.
It's always, there are many different opinions and many different kind of thoughts about how the community, because we are part of the community. And so I feel that from what I have read, because again, I'm an incomer, so I'm learning as we go along. We've been learning a lot about, particularly the trees and the landscape are an incredibly important part, not only to certain people, but to the overall kind of landscape of the island itself. They're so rare, right? They're so few, relatively speaking, to the whole kind of island space. We do get a lot of people speaking either directly to the park rangers there or to our park management, who provide a lot of good insight. And we try to listen as best we can, balancing as well the kind of broader kind of seashore concerns and then the national concerns as well for the area. Yeah.
How do you work through the trade-offs between resiliency and historical integrity and economic factors and probably a handful of others as you work through this?
That is again, very carefully. We try to, there are kind of a series of kind of measurements and metrics that we use to assess how, significance of a structure, depending on the type of material we go with, we kind of balance between cost and also the requirements of preservation from the State Historic Preservation Office, but also our own Secretary of the Interior standards that we have to follow. A lot of it we are beginning to follow and creating new standards as well. Recently, the Park Service came out with a new preservation brief. The Park Service creates these, you can find them all online. I think it's Preservation Brief 51. Don't quote me on that. But it's on substitute materials. So, for a long time, we have worked off of, in-kind materials, the similar kinds. If it's wood, it's wood. If it's metal, it's this. But people have become to understand that sometimes those in-kind materials may not be the best material to use, either because they're too expensive. A good example is redwood, right? We can't really use redwood anymore unless it's reclaimed. Or it can be, or kind of like cast iron, which again can be oxidized much faster than other types of metals. So that's where we start to think through, well, are there other types of materials? Are there other types of coatings? Are there other, and that's when we begin to kind of bring in experts from various things. I'm not an expert in anything in particular, so I always like to bring in, other people who are really good specialists in those fields, particularly in those material fields. So it is a conversation. To answer that question, it is a conversation between the economies, the value of its history, as well as the overall value of its significance to the national story as well.
Other questions? All right. Thank you, George. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And again, thanks everybody for coming. We'll see you next time.